Thanks for having me. It's really an honour to be invited to speak by Yes Men who've long stood, the Yes Men have long stood in my pantheon of political heroes. And it's nice to be at NYU, although New York is my hometown and I live quite close by. There's a particular connection between NYU and this book, which is, I spent a year in the Bobes Library several years ago when I took a sabbatical from my job in the Foreign Office, and that was the kind of small germ that led to this thing, this book, which is kind of fortuitously published right now. It was published last week, and everybody says, oh, how brilliant, it's all come out because of Occupy and the Arab Spring and all this kind of stuff, and aren't you clever to bring it out right now? And I have to confess it's just pure fluke, because the book was supposed to be finished and published 2 years ago, and my failure to submit it on time is the only reason that it's come out now, and thus seems prescient and timely, as opposed to irrelevant. Anyway, the book is a kind of very radical thesis. It's basically that it's time to give up on looking to government to solve our political problems, that the only alternative is to take action ourselves. In some senses that might be described as anarchism, and indeed many of the ideas of the book echo earlier ideas of anarchism, but I hasten to add it's a very, very, very gentle kind of anarchism. I don't believe in violence, at least not anymore after I left the government, and it's a very consultative, non-coercive kind of anarchism, but it is basically about self-organising to achieve political ends, that no longer is it plausible to look to government, that governments are actually proving themselves incapable of managing the affairs of the world successfully. So I'm going to very briefly try to explain how I got to this very radical thesis, but also try to explain a bit more what it is. I won't talk for very long, probably no more than about 20 minutes, because I'd much rather have a discussion with you guys. And I was thinking about this stuff when I was, probably like many of you, I watched the State of the Union speech, which is always a really kind of bizarre piece of political theatre, that kind of rapturous applause when the State of the Union is strong. And I thought there was a particular moment which for me summed up something that's very sick and wrong about the current system of politics, and that was that, I'm sure you remember it, when President Obama was talking about the Buffett tax, to have fair taxes for people earning millions as well as everybody else. And at that moment they picked out Warren Buffett's secretary sitting in the audience, who was this kind of nice middle-aged lady with glasses, smiling sweetly. And it was totally cringe-making, the moment. Like, she'd been invited clearly to be picked out by the cameras. The cameras had been pre-briefed to kind of zoom in on her at that precise moment. And I thought about this moment and the sort of semiotics of this moment and of the absurdity of it, because the likelihood is that, President Obama's wish to see a Buffett tax is almost certain to go unfulfilled. No such tax is likely to be implemented, certainly not anytime soon. And indeed, the other absurdity of it is that we're only talking about that tax because Warren Buffett himself raised it in a famous op-ed in the New York Times, which to me really kind of says all you need to know about the state of politics today. Anyway, with that little vignette, I'll try to explain how I arrived at this kind of philosophy, because it was a bizarre kind of journey from somebody who really very much believed in the conventional model of politics, who spent a lot of his career convinced that government, when comprised of decent, well-meaning people, as of course I regarded myself. Oh, hello.
Are you the leader?
No, there isn't a leader here. Greetings. I believe that government, when composed of rational, decent people, could actually do good. And indeed, my career was committed to that idea. I was a diplomat in the British Foreign Service for 15 years. And I probably still would be a British diplomat, albeit a rather unhappy one, in probably some distant embassy somewhere, had it not been for the Iraq War. So in some way, I'm actually quite grateful to Dick Cheney and others for launching me on this new trajectory, because the Iraq War really forced me to leave the government. I'd been Britain's Iraq expert at the UN Security Council. I'd been our liaison with the weapons inspectors. I set up the UN weapons inspection body, UNMAVIC. I was deeply immersed in all the intelligence on Iraq's WMD, what little there was of it. After the war took place, I didn't heroically resign in protest when it began. There was an official inquiry into the use of intelligence on WMD in the run-up to the war, and I testified in secret to this inquiry. In secret because I was then still a British diplomat, and I wanted to stay a British diplomat, but my testimony was highly critical of the government, because it said point by point how the government had exaggerated the evidence, and it also said, to me, a rather more important point, that the government had ignored available alternatives to war, which seems to me a fundamental failure. And we can go into that if anybody wishes to talk about it. It's a rather technical argument, but that was the reason I gave that evidence. And after sending it off, I fired it from a computer in Pristina, Kosovo, because I was working there at the time. And I just thought, I can't go on, I've got to leave. It wasn't a kind of, moral moment for me. I just felt sick. I felt sick of my colleagues. I felt I couldn't go back and look them in the eye and smile at them and say, yes, Minister. And also more personally, you probably heard the story of the British weapons scientist who committed suicide after he'd been caught briefing the press, as I had been on background anonymously about the exaggerations of WMD, who was hounded to his death by the Blair government. This man was a good friend of mine and a close colleague, and I was so disgusted by this event, as I remain to this day, and the lack of accountability for it, that I just thought it's over. I can't go back. So that was a rather abrupt divorce and painful divorce for me, because I really believed that I was going to be a diplomat in this system. I really believed that there was a kind of rational structure to the world, that governments would interact according to certain sets of understandings, values and interests, and that collectively we would create some kind of order. And I'd become a diplomat in 1989, which was, of course, the apogee of Western confidence that we had the answers to everything. We had formulated the end of history. We brought down the Soviet bloc, and now really it was just a march to drag everybody towards this ideal of liberal democracy and open markets. And that kind of understanding suffused my work around the world. And when I quit, the Iraq thing kind of obviously deeply shocked me. But I also sort of looked at the rest of what I'd been doing as a diplomat. I was also closely involved in the invasion of Afghanistan. And I realized that the claims that government was making about these situations, for instance, its claim that it understood Afghanistan or Iraq, and knew what would happen after they invaded these places, these claims were basically ridiculous. I mean, I think that's the only word one can use for them, because the claim that we can understand somewhere as complicated and as foreign as Afghanistan or Iraq, frankly, is basically ludicrous. And indeed, I took the analysis much wider and began to examine government's claims of efficacy in all kinds of different contexts. This became a sort of investigation for me, a test. What were the claims of government and what was the evidence of their success or failure? And what I found, of course, was that the claims that government was making of its ability to manage and arbitrate the world and its problems were hugely divergent from the reality of the outputs that they were producing. And this is a core idea of the thesis and indeed of the book, that you have to measure political process by the outputs, not by the claims of it, not by the virtues or aesthetics or beauties of the process itself, but by its outputs. What does the world really look like once we have implemented our policy? And, excuse me, the orangina was a bad mistake. I knew it would be. Often advised not to drink fizzy drinks before speaking, and I've ignored it tonight. Forgive me. But there was also kind of, oddly enough, almost like a deeper aesthetic sort of malaise going on with me. I'd really kind of been brought up to believe that things were basically going to get better in the world, that progress would triumph over everything. And I looked around me and I saw, the grotesque events that were going on around the world in the Middle East, some perpetrated by our own democratic governments, but also, environmental damage, but also the persistence of poverty and mounting inequality. And I just thought that actually there's something profoundly wrong here. I felt that this picture was basically ugly, and it bothered me. I felt that I was not satisfied to live in this world as it was. I felt that if I continued to live in it and not try to address it, I would become more and more despairing, I suppose. And so I began to try to think, if the current dispensation, the current system of politics, of governments, liberal democracies, markets, is not working to manage the world's problems, what might? And whilst I was doing this sort of research and analysis and formulating these arguments, this book was started 5 years ago, the credit crunch happened. And the credit crunch seemed to me to encapsulate many of the things. I mean, in my mind, it's a bit like the collapse of the Berlin Wall. It's an event of that kind of significance. And I think for many people, similarly, it's taken us a while for it to really realize that it's true depth of what has taken place. But to me, it kind of epitomized many of, or encapsulated, or captured many of the real problems of the current system, namely that governments had not predicted it, they were not managing it as it took place. Their response to it was incredibly clumsy, and that their response was highly influenced by the political influence of the banks, of the wealthy. And for that reason, that was one reason why its response was so inadequate. There were many others, though. The failure of the banking system at that time was a highly complex event. Whether it was the failure of the loosening of legislation to encourage home buying, whether it was the irresponsible lending of banks, subprime loans, or the irresponsible borrowing of those taking the loans, or banks underestimating the degree of interconnectedness in the financial market, in the mortgage system, that when one mortgage went bad, the others tipped over, and the collapse accelerated. That the actual algorithmic models that the banks were using to predict economic events did not properly estimate complexity. They underestimated the complexity of the system. But for all this kind of analytical, esoterica, the worst thing about it was that, of course, that the poorest were affected most of all. Across the world, the poorest suffered by far the most from the banking crisis, and we can safely assume that many thousands of people died because of the banking crisis for various reasons, because of the collapse of economies. It's always the poorest who suffer most. Joblessness affects them worst. The reduction of public services. This is just the West, not to speak of the effects in the developing world. So this was a kind of, for me, a kind of crucible of everything that was wrong. And in the, in the analysis of what might work instead, I kind of went back to first principles and sort of tried to see the world as it actually was, rather than this depiction of separate states and rational governments making sensible policy decisions on the basis of an arbitration of competing interests. And our classical, if you like, model of democracy and markets. And indeed, my analysis extended to neoclassical economics, which I'd learned at university. And one realized the grotesque inadequacy of that analytical system to explain really almost anything that's going on in the economy, from an individual's decision to buy an iPod to the movement of currency markets. Neoclassical economics has basically totally failed as an analytical system, and yet this is our kind of philosophical framework for the way we interpret the world. Of course, one of the most grotesque failures of neoclassical models is its sidelining of things like environmental damage or the social costs of economic transformation as so-called externalities, literally external to the model. And this was one reason the model had failed in the credit crunch, but it's actually another reason why the model is failing more broadly today. And I suppose there was one fundamental sort of insight that occurred to me, and it's occurred to many others. And I'm grateful to a boarding professor in Michigan who actually explained this to me on a DVD course that I watched about the science of complexity. The world is, of course, a complex system. It has billions of actors interacting more or less constantly in a dynamic process that is literally impossible to understand in detail, in microcosmic detail. The causes of any event are myriad, they are constantly changing. The action of one person will cause a reaction from another in a constant dynamic and fluid process that static models and simplistic structural understandings and analytical frameworks completely fail to capture. And the science of complexity, which is an emerging science and by no means developed, which I rather kind of primitively applied to this sort of political analysis that I was developing, is very clear. The analysis of what affects complex systems is, at least in this part, very clear, namely that top-down control and authority does not work. You cannot understand a complex system by trying to take snapshots of it and make predictions that if you take action A, consequence B will follow, and then consequence C. That's not how a complex system works. Instead, the thing that is most powerful in a complex system is, oddly, the action of the individual agents and the people around them, the agents around them. This is a completely kind of paradoxical idea because you're looking at a global system of billions and billions of things constantly interacting. Prices, goods, people, the environment. And you think that surely we need some kind of comprehensive overview of it. We need some kind of model that will give us a top-down picture of what this thing is. And if we have lots of sensible people at the top, maybe even a world government, we will understand and be able to manage this thing. And you can see this kind of thinking reflected in things like the G20, where there's an idea that if smart people sit around, the most powerful economies sit around, they will understand what's going on in the world. The Basel Committee in the financial system is another example of it. The UN Security Council in peace and security is an embodiment of this kind of top-down idea of structure of how we interpret the world and indeed manage it. And God knows I spent 4.5 years on the UN Security Council, and it is a highly, highly inadequate body to arbitrate our affairs for many reasons that are familiar, but for one which is perhaps less familiar, that is kind of obvious, which it is grossly separated from reality. We would debate Kosovo, Iraq, Palestine, terrorism, sitting in a stuffy room on the East River, not a couple of miles from here, 7,000 miles from the places we were discussing, and we thought that we could understand them. And I realized in my own work in Iraq and Afghanistan, I served in Afghanistan after the invasion, I realized that this was just idiotic. Our claims to understand these things were absurd. The division between reality and what we were saying about it was, it was like we were sort of just making up things about it. It was that poor. And of course what we did in diplomacy is what we do in economics and indeed in government. We create the theory of how it's working first, and then we go out and seek the evidence to justify that theory. I did it in the embassy in Afghanistan. I went to talk to democratic Afghans who told me there would be a democratic future in Afghanistan. Of course I didn't talk to any of the other ones who had a rather different view of it, not least because they wouldn't talk to us. But equally, similarly, in economics, we tend to measure particular things about the economy which we think are controllable. Thus, we think we've developed a rational understanding of them. And it seems to me that, at a fundamental level, we are applying the wrong kind of intellectual frameworks to the way the world actually is. If it is a complex system, the most powerful agent in it is the individual. The individual has the power to affect the people around them, and through that ripple effect, which Malcolm Gladwell and others have described much more eloquently than I can, you can actually alter the entire system. This is extraordinary. What we're actually saying here is that rather than government, the individual is the most powerful agent of change. That's kind of radical for the 21st century. Actually, we tend to think the opposite. We tend to think we are totally impotent, that we have no power, that only if we can influence all those people up there by waving our banners and writing endless petitions and emails to them, will we affect any change in anything that really matters. What can I do, we say to ourselves? Well, actually, weirdly, bizarrely, you are the most powerful agent there is. All kinds of evidence in network theory, complexity theory bears this out, the way that change transmits through systems. Evidence abounds in the natural world, but also in human affairs. Take, for instance, the spread of suicide bombing, which is something I talk about in the book, rather sort of provocatively. But suicide bombing, arguably one of the most effective techniques of political military engagement there has been in the late 20th century. It succeeded in getting Israel out of South Lebanon, where it kind of originated, though in parallel it was also happening in Sri Lanka. It started in a small place. Suicide bombing has now spread to every continent in the world. It is the weapon of choice of all kinds of disaffected groups, from the Kurds in Turkey to Tamils, Tamil Tigers before the end of the civil war in Sri Lanka, to Islamists, if that's the right word, because I think that too is a highly simplistic way of describing what's going on, fundamentalist terrorists in Kenya and Uganda. Uganda is now experiencing suicide bombings. Absolutely extraordinary. Anyway, this shows that this mechanism of change, of how in a highly interconnected system, which is what we have today, change in one place can very quickly be transmitted to the entire world. This is a new dispensation. It is not like the world of the 20th century. Something new has happened. It is completely different, almost in every aspect, from the world that we had in the 20th century. And yet we continue to apply the models of the 20th century, both in our politics, our government, and our general kind of cultural understanding of how things work, that are basically out of date. We have to develop new models. And this is the rather grandiose claim that this book is making. And it's saying that actually the most effective means of change is the individual. The evidence of government's decline in arbitrating events is all around us. Their failure to manage economic volatility, which is mounting. You look at a highly developed rules-based system like the EU, it is failing to manage one currency successfully. Because there are so many working parts of that system that they are failing to arbitrate them, they're failing to predict them, not through lack of goodwill, highly able people involved, but they are failing. The one, though, the two that bother me emotionally most of all, because I'm no great fan of the European currency for various reasons, none of them to do with the fact of my nationality, but the two things that I think are most concerning are two things that seem inexorable and something we really can't do anything about. One is inequality, which is mounting everywhere in the world dramatically. Wealth is concentrating in the hands of a very small minority. Elsewhere, incomes and wealth are more or less stagnated, particularly in developed economies, but this phenomenon is also now evident in places like China and India, which of course are lauded for very good reasons as having dragged large numbers of people out of poverty, but even in these places inequality is rapidly increasing too. So this seems to be some kind of function of the world economy, perhaps something about the network effect, where in a globalized flat system the successful few attract all the wealth, everything. It's the argument why eBay, for instance, is now vast, and all other marketplace sites, however good they are, even if they're better than eBay basically earn nothing, because everybody goes to eBay because they can, and because everybody thinks everybody else is going to eBay. It's why Facebook is so successful. It's called the network effect. I'm suspicious that something like that is happening in the world economy, that actually wealth is attracting to a very, very few people, and everybody else is going to remain pretty flat. But this is just an unproven hypothesis. But the other thing that is very deeply concerning is the global environment, which is getting rapidly worse. I worked on the first World Summit on the Environment, the so-called Earth Summit in 1992. I worked on the preparations, the preparatory negotiations on that. Great claims were made for that conference that it will deal with the problems of the world environment. It would tackle, we didn't even call it global warming. We thought there was a possible risk of global warming like 300 years in the future. We now seem to be experiencing it immediately now. And yet we continue to be subjected to claims from governments and international processes like the UN that they have this problem under control. The Durban conference finished recently, the part of the UN climate change process. If you read about this, even today, you will see lots and lots of claims that this conference was a success. It was a successful conference. It rescued the climate change process. But that is, in fact, all it did. It rescued the climate change process. Its effect on the world, the actual concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, which is the real output, the real measure of political process, is, of course, nil. If not negative, given all the flying that went into his many, many thousands of meetings and delegates getting to those meetings. And this isn't just a cynical view. It's not a cynical view at all. It's just saying, let's look at the outputs of these processes and judge them by that. That's the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter whether we got 192 countries to agree to a declaration. That doesn't matter in terms of the environment. All they agreed to do in Durban was to agree in 4 years' time that they would agree a treaty then. That's why it's a success. That's all they agreed. I don't know if many of you know that, but that is literally what they agreed. And this was lauded as a great success. This seems to me to epitomise the problem that we have. We are confronted with these claims of efficacy, and yet the world is manifesting these really very grave problems. Self-organised action. I won't go on much more because I've waxed rather too lyrical about the theoretical and analytical ideas behind this. It's actually a very practical manifesto. It really is saying that the only thing that really matters is taking action yourself. It proposes various principles that should govern that action, because of course if we all did what we wanted and just ignored each other, we would of course enter a Hobbesian state of nature, which is another of the main claims that conventional political systems make, that but for them that's the state into which we would fall, for which there is no real evidence whatsoever. And my view increasingly is that the current system is in fact fomenting disorder, and that a more self-organised system where people actually took responsibility for affairs into their own hands would in some fundamental way be more stable. Not least because it would reconnect us at a horizontal level. I don't know about you, but I feel pretty alienated from my fellow man most of the time. When I'm on the subway or walking on the street, mostly I feel hostile or frightened. In some kind of fundamental way, I don't... I have nice neighbours, I have various people I like in the world, but basically the world seems to me to be hostile. And that seems to have got worse. I don't remember feeling this when I was much younger. I don't remember the quality of public behaviour being quite as bad as it is today. In London, for instance, and I'll sound like some ridiculous old person, remembering through rose-tinted spectacles the good old days. But in London, you used to have bus conductors on our double-decker buses who were kind of nice gents who would wind you a ticket. It was all very nice and I've forgotten the word. Sorry, my English is I've forgotten various things. Sorry. But anyway, today on London buses, you will have a driver who is completely sealed behind a screen, which would protect him against both knives and guns. Which are actually totally illegal in Britain, but actually quite widespread in London. And it is not uncommon to see incidents where drivers will stop their car in front of the bus and get in and abuse the driver and spit at him, leaving a sort of vast sort of gobbet of excretion on this screen for which it was designed. And you just kind of think, this is so ugly. What the hell are we doing? Why does it have to be so ugly? Surely we can do better than this. And I have great faith. I think this is one of the fundamental ideas that animates me, the philosophy, and indeed anarchists of the past, peaceful anarchists of the past. It is actually not a belief in violence or disorder, it is a belief in people. It's about believing in people and their fundamental ability to do good, rather than a claim endlessly repeated by government and asserted in all kinds of subtle and insidious ways that you should not trust other people, that they're basically bad. And then if the rules are lifted, it's going to be chaos. It's going to be everybody's at your throat straight away. And you see this, the cultural manifestations of this in places like New Orleans after Katrina, where very quickly the cultural, the mainstream media basically attempted to depict it as anarchy and chaos. Of, you know, the animals are now out of their cages. This is what you get when disaster strikes and there is no government, there is no police to keep order. Civic panic. In fact, what happens much more frequently in these situations, as Rebecca Solnit has very brilliantly written, and I fully recommend her books to you, you actually get extraordinary scenes of solidarity, of community, of people helping each other. Not through with governments helping them. Governments usually days later. We saw this in New York after 9/11. I'm sure many of you were here. An extraordinary sense of very personal solidarity, of community with each other, of people on the subway kind of just connecting in a way that they had never had before. Hans Nozick writes about this in a book called The End, which he wrote after the firebombing of Hamburg. Which was, of course, far, far worse than 9/11, and he writes of a similar phenomenon. The thing that most struck him about those days was not the suffering, not the desire for revenge, because he said, actually, those who called for revenge were regarded basically as ludicrous. They were ostracized. But the thing that was most striking about it was the community that arose in a situation with no government, in devastation. And in a smaller way, that's what we saw here in the city after 9/11, and it was a very, very powerful, moving thing to see. So, faith in people. That's the note I would like to end on, and invite your questions and points. Thank you.
There is it perhaps sounds ludicrous, but the sense of the power of the individual is really a mechanism that's been known for 30 plus years in advertising. Advertising is 85% word of mouth.
Yeah.
And people buy because they've spoken to someone, not because they've seen an ad. 15% will buy because they saw an ad. And that's where you're getting the dynamic of people spreading the ideas. What's happening now that didn't happen, say, 20, 30 years ago in the 20th century is communications. We've got the global communications. I can go on and I can see, news from around the world on the internet. And so I'm seeing and I'm hearing and I'm getting the pictures. And that's really where you're spreading the word.
Yeah.
What a book I might recommend to you that I think is key. It's not a new book. Jack Weatherford has a book called The History of Money. Mm-hmm. And it talks about the dynamic, the origins and the dynamic of how money as a medium affects everything. It becomes an exchange, or it's a metaphor for everything. And I think a lot of the issues that people are struggling with are being missed because we don't have an interdisciplinary approach in the same way that we have this sort of fragmented view of the world. We have a fragmented view of knowledge, and we're only just beginning to deal with exploring ideas from an interdisciplinary approach.
Well, I mean, it's very odd reading political thinkers of the 19th or 20th century. Was a lot of them were bold enough to make claims about the nature of the world. Mm-hmm. Often they were very wrong, and I think they were wrong in trying to, like Marx or indeed, neoclassical economics, trying to make structural systems that explained everything. I think that's now impossible, and I think the need to tie off all the loose ends is a sort of a real weakness of those models. But one of the oddities of the current dispensation is the lack of ambition to try to understand everything that's going on, and
at an academic level or political level.
Just, I think politically, I think we've been beaten into submission that the current system is the only one that's available, and that the economy and the advertising and all that ugliness and the inequality and is just the way people are. There's a connection between, it's called the theory of revealed preferences, which is a key theory of neoclassical economics, that you actually purchase decisions by people actually reveal their preferences. Kind of obvious idea. But of course, it's in many ways it's very similar to Darwinian thinking, or actually rather false interpretations of Darwin, simplistic interpretations of Darwin, because Darwin actually also shows, and Kropotkin writes about this a lot, a Russian anarchist, that actually community and solidarity are equally important traits in successful species as competition. So we've even got the animal kingdom to show us the way.
Sure.
Right, but thanks for the recommendation. Yes?
I was wondering, you're talking about faith in the human spirit and the ability to create communities. I was wondering what happens to that idea in a world that becomes more and more isolated, where people spend more and more of their time, at least in the United States, in like the capsule environment, in their car, in front of their TV, in front of their computer.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a correct analysis. It's rather grim, and the book actually cites a lot of this evidence of people feeling more lonely, communities being more fragmented, more people living alone. I mean, it's very much an attempt to address that, to say, actually, if you locate a political issue that you really mind about and you organise to actually address that thing rather than campaigning for other people to address it, whatever it is, say it's, I don't know, you think that the way your grandmother's being treated in the home that she's in is terrible. What are you going to do about it? Or you dislike the messiness of your street, or the way your building is managed, or it can be very microcosmic to the global. You're concerned about global warming. But if you actually organise yourself to directly address that thing, you will connect with other people, because there are other people out there like you who are concerned about the same thing. And I think this is one of the most beautiful things about Occupy, is that both in Zuccotti Park in the early weeks, but also I'm in a working group that's looking at alternative banking. There's an extraordinarily diverse group of people who I never would have met in other circumstances, who are united by a kind of disgust with the current system. And because we all share this concern, and we're now trying to work together to build a bank, no less, to solve that problem. There is a real sense of kind of solidarity, of community amongst us. I mean, it has its bad moments. There's some disruptive people, and Occupy has suffered a lot from that in the last couple of months, particularly since the eviction. But Occupy in many ways manifests its politics. The meetings, the way the meetings are handled, in a participatory fashion, a real belief in consensus. Anybody can speak. A Stanford professor called James Fishkin has done a lot of experiments with decision-making models, and those that are most inclusive, this is so obvious it's kind of ridiculous, but you actually sometimes need an academic to tell you this. Those are the most inclusive, are the most successful. They produce the most equitable outcomes. People are committed to them. People respect each other more. There's actually a physical example of this in Porto Alegre, Brazil, where they had I'm not sure if they continue it, mass participation in decision-making, budget-making for the city. Literally 50,000 people a year would take part in debates to decide the budget. Now, these weren't debates with politicians like town hall meetings, where all you get is kind of people yelling at each other and wanting to make their point. They are making real decisions about the provision of services, water, education, hospitals. And what they found, there was a study after 10 years of this by the World Bank, the city was much more equal. Because everybody had been included, of course, rather than an elite who had particular access to the political system, or special access to the political system. Services were much more widely distributed, fairly distributed. But also, oddly, there was a change in the political culture. It was much less partisan. Because decisions were transparent, there was no corruption. And there was a much greater sense of civic respect. Because when you're in a room with somebody, and this is what we're finding in the Occupy Working Group, when you're in a room with somebody and you're actually making real decisions rather than debating something where actually your decision does not matter, which is what we spend most of our time debating when we're watching, presidential debates or arguing on the internet. Our decisions actually don't matter a damn. It doesn't matter one jot what we think about Newt Gingrich or what we say in the chat room about global warming or Al-Qaeda, whatever it doesn't matter. It's completely impact-free. But if you have a group that's deciding something that does matter, people really listen to each other because they know that they're going to still be around when you made the decision. And it's not very nice sometimes. And in the working group, it was very interesting, the dynamic of when people came at the beginning, lots and lots of people came and everybody wanted to have their say. There was, I've got to have my say. Scores of little speeches about what was wrong. But once people have got that out of their system, we listen to each other. And it's been pretty extraordinary. So I hope that there's some prospect of actually reweaving, that awful sense of fragmentation and disconnection. I don't believe the internet is enough to do that. And in many ways, I feel that the internet actually is such a distancing thing. People are so hostile to each other on the internet. Email is so easy to misinterpret. People are much ruder. Interestingly, we also have a Google group for our Occupy working group. And people are much ruder to each other online than they are in person. They say things they would never say to each other in person. And I also, unlike people very close to here, I'm not a kind of evangelist of the kind of democratizing power of the internet. I think it's as easily manipulable by the powerful and the tyrannical. Sorry, a rather long answer. Yes.
I was just in Spain recently, and I'm wondering what your thoughts might be regarding what I thought was a powerful Indignados movement, or the 15M movement, that seemed to gain some traction, and yet the Pepe is the latest president, newly elected president, is right-wing. He's preaching privatization, he's preaching cutting social spending, all the neoliberal ideals. And so, I think it's great to think that the individual can promote change, but it's so frustrating to see what's happened in Spain this past year.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and I think this is a crucial point in the book, that protest is not enough, and actually protest is often a great distraction. I think that I worry that our propensity to protest, particularly kind of useless things like internet petitions, actually uses up our political energy, which is a scarce resource. You think you've done something. I've written to my congressman, or I've showed up at a demonstration if you're really, really committed. And in fact, you've done nothing. And I worry that that's the risk of Occupy, that it's too much about protest. And what we're trying to do in the working group is actually build something. And this is a key argument in the book, that you cannot look to the current system to reform itself. Turkeys will not vote for Thanksgiving. There are too many interests vested in the way that it is. The idea that we can actually influence this grotesquely corrupted system from the outside, I think, is not. I'm not just going to insult it and say it's naive. It's been proven wrong over and over again, and it's getting worse. Whether you want to mention Citizens United or all kinds of legislation that's actually written by lobbyists, let alone influenced by them. So I say, don't look to the political system to listen to you. Build something better, and you will find that act of building extraordinarily rich and fulfilling. It is very, very difficult. It is complicated. But actually you have a real chance of changing things if you do it, and far more chance than merely protesting. And I think the Indignados and Occupy bear the same risk of just sort of dwelling in a place of protest, and that won't be sufficient. I don't think it will be anything like enough to really.
So they should build a party that would.
No. On the contrary, I mean, build new systems of working. Set up a cooperative. Set up what we're trying to do. We're trying to build a bank that is transparent, democratic, owned by its customers, and by its employees, that it would employ banking practices that didn't expose the economy to systemic risk like the current for-profit system, that would be available to everybody, particularly the poorest who are often excluded from the current banking system. This is what we're trying to design. There would actually be a new system of banking that, if it was successful, could plausibly replace the current system, no less. It's actually a plausible possibility. I mean, hugely ambitious, but why the hell not? I mean, I think we all feel in the group that Occupy has produced an extraordinary political space to do things like that. But that space will not last. It will be closed. You can already see it closing. When Republicans are appropriating the rhetoric of Occupy, you know that the movement is being slowly eviscerated before our very eyes. This is what happened to the 68 revolution. It didn't produce any fundamental social change. It produced a bunch of T-shirt logos with Che Guevara.
But then what happens when you build a cooperative bank, what happens when that bumps up against the powers that be and they make it illegal?
Well, that's what they've done. They've made credit unions. You cannot have a national credit union in this country. Federal law prevents it. No, I mean, you can't.
No.
Not one that has universal access.
Yes, you do. We'll talk about it.
Well, I'd be delighted to hear it. I mean, various heads of credit unions has told me the opposite. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a fundamental problem. When you start to take away what they get out of the current system, there will be conflict. But I think the power of the mass, when energized, is much more powerful. I mean, we are far more than they are, really. You know, it is actually a minority who is making the world like this. I don't think most people believe in a system that is solely about profit. I think people fundamentally, they don't even believe it. They act it every single day. They are not purely self-interested. They believe that other things to which money values cannot be put, like meaning, like compassion, are equally, if not more important. Yes.
I don't think it's too difficult to, accept the premise that governments just simply are incapable of solving certain problems, which, like the, global warming or something like that, or massive inequality, they simply are incapable of doing it. But even on an individual level, like, how do you deal with the issue of ideology? The way that certain beliefs are formed, even on an individual level, the way that we develop a consensus or something like that, when if you just leave government out of the issue, I mean, the fact of the matter is that the concepts that we use to think about the reality that confronts us are formed by being in a particular world system, the capitalist world system. And I mean, you can see that the issues that are all over the media, such as, like, a few years ago, the debt crisis or something, this was not really an issue to individuals in their everyday life, but because for big business it was a huge issue, so that was what we all started talking about, things like that. So I'm wondering what you think about the role that ideology plays in belief formation amongst individuals, and how we can kind of try to get outside of certain ideologies which are formed through the media and other means like that.
I think it's an incredibly important question and very difficult, because what are the ways we think about the world but a collection of ideologies about how it functions and what we think is important. I think, for a start, the way you framed it is very important, because I think it's very important to see the current system as an ideology rather than as a natural state of affairs. And I think there is an attempt to portray it as a natural state of affairs, that capitalism, I saw John Lloyd in the Financial Times write that capitalism is not an ideology, it is a system, which I don't think is true. I think what underpins that system is a set of beliefs. They're not scientific truths about how society and the economy functions. Individuals are basically self-seeking, companies should seek profit at the micro level up to macroeconomic assumptions. Those are beliefs, almost every one of which you can prove to be false, and they thus, in certain circumstances, and they thus fail Popper's test of verifiability, and that cannot be treated as as truth. And I think my kind of very tentative answer to your question does slightly reflect my own experience from sitting in the Security Council offering ideological views about the world, be they Afghanistan or Iraq or Kosovo, then actually going to these places. I think that when you take people to confront a reality in a particular circumstance, rather than talking about it in abstract terms, you see the real thing, like a sick child or something, all ideology falls away and you just kind of decide what you're going to do about it. Very interestingly, I saw this phenomenon I know these are kind of lots of diplomatic examples, that's not because they're particularly right, it's because it's just my experience. In the Security Council, we often have deeply entrenched divides about, say, Kosovo or Cote d'Ivoire, and they instituted a practice where the ambassadors would go to this place for often a very short period, like a day or two. But what was extraordinary is when they went there, they tended to agree much more than when they were in New York arguing about them. Because when you actually see real life, you can't dispute what you see before your eyes, hard evidence. And that, I guess, would be my very tentative answer to that problem. One of the odd things about anarchism is it is an ideology about rejecting ideology. It's saying there is no system, there is no form, or structure is wrong, or hierarchy is wrong, which of course is a set of beliefs. And this is why for Noam Chomsky and others it has been a brilliant platform as a critique of the current system, from which to criticize the current system. But I think they need to go a step further and actually develop a positive, dare I say, ideology of change, which is based in reality, based in confronting each other in the real world. I know that it all sounds terribly kind of vapid, but I think you kind of know what I mean. If you and I went up to, I don't know, some part of town, the poorest part of town, and looked at it and said what can be done about this. Above all, the interesting thing about my work in Independent Diplomat is almost every assumption you make about what those people will say is almost certainly wrong. I mean, I've worked in Sudan, Kosovo, all kinds, Somalia, about which great, pontifications are made around the world, and in almost every case people have been remarkably different and very vocal when you go and meet them. Sorry, a rather, circular way of trying to answer your question, but I hope something. Yes.
One thing that amazes me, and I totally agree with you, that in our system, the rich are getting richer, the inequality is increasing because the rich can afford the lobbyists and can afford to shape government in the way they want. One thing that amazes me, though, is that there is some kind of balance where there still are labor laws, there are still consumer protections, there's still environmental groups that have some impact. Nowhere near as much as we would want, but they're still out there and they're having some impact. And is that a sign that our system isn't totally broken, in that the poor, the unpowerful are still able to have some voice and keep the system from being completely out of whack? And I know that it's largely so, but I mean, Obama, just because of a lot of political pressure, just appointed Schneiderman to be overseeing some task force, which I'm sure will be greatly flawed, but it's still there. And it's something that happened because of political pressure. So in some way, do you think the system does work when there is enough movement, or SOAP is an example of how you can get groups that still have corporate money, they still...
Yeah,
but
mostly by corporates lobbying for it. I mean, as far as I can see, Google is a large corporate.
Sure.
It's a fair question. I'm afraid my answer is going to be blunt, which is I think these are just things that are set up to delude us. You see this. It's interesting that many of the examples you mentioned were about process. They've set up a task force to address this. We've got SOPA, which we pulled down, which is just a law. It's not actually reality, it's just a law. And I'm talking about the real world, and you say the poor have a fair crack of the whip. in our political system. Well,
I didn't say that. I said that there's some processes in place. As theater. That's largely theater. It's entirely theater.
I'm doing you an injustice. I don't think what is problematic about it is I don't think it's theatre because I don't think people in it think it's theatre.
No, they don't.
I was in government and, you know, a lot of people say, oh, diplomacy is a load of crap, you're just making it all up, you're pretending you understand the world. And I actually said, no, we really, really believe that we do understand the world. I really was committed to that system. And this is why it's so entrenched, and this is why forms of protest, which were very successful in achieving things like equal voting rights, are not going to be successful in changing a highly complicated and entrenched cultural and political system. It is very deeply within us as much as it is within the system. There is no one thing that we can do that will alter it. Marching to Washington to demand the changes I'm talking about, even if it succeeded, you know, what would be that change? It would fail. No, this is a cultural change as much as it's a political change. And I say, you know, my answer to you is look at the outputs. That's my answer to you. Measurements, things that you can measure. And oddly, you can measure suffering and poverty much more easily than you can measure happiness. And I think this is one of the fundamental lies of the political system, is that politicians always say, I will make things better, but actually making things better is immeasurable. You can't measure that. You can never know. Whereas actually stopping real suffering is measurable. Start there, measure suffering, let that be your measure of success of the system. Yes?
I'm interested in what was a very quick sort of dismissal of the internet's power to organize communities, which, I mean, it makes sense to me that the internet has this kind of atomizing quality to it, and this, we sit in front of our screens. But in terms of actually creating solutions, like deployable solutions, thinking about alternative banking, I think about the internet a lot in terms of alternative currencies and alternative economic models.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, to me, the internet and the power to link people quickly and easily and transparently is one of the great assets we have moving forward. And I think one of the things that makes our attempts at building solutions now more possible than it's ever been, and especially looking at open source collaboration on the tech side that is now being transmitted to an open source approach to sharing and information.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering.
No, you're absolutely right, and my dismissal was far too quick and glib, and it's partly because it's in antagonistic contrast to the claim that the internet is the answer, which you will hear occasionally in this city and elsewhere. No, you're absolutely right, and in some ways I think the internet is actually causing the cultural shift that I'm talking about, because it is inherently flat, it's more transparent, and the open source movement is a precise example of the sort of thing I'm talking about. You're absolutely right. And indeed, people like Douglas Rushkoff, who's on the same page as me, talk about open source politics. I would rather not confine it to the tech field, I'd rather make it more culturally accessible. But you're quite right, I think it does make things possible that were not possible before. And I think that about technology. Talking about currency is interesting. Some of the most radical systems of alternative banking are actually happening already in places like Brazil and Africa. And they're happening through mobile phones. The M-Pesa system in Kenya is a very, very transparent, simple, easily accessible system to everybody, to the poor, as much as the rich. If only we could do that here, federal law makes it very, very difficult to do it. But yes, no, you're right. And yeah. Yes?
I wanted to ask you about this group you run, independent diplomats.
Yeah.
Is that, do you try to bring sort of anti-top-down diplomacy to that field, or somehow I always feel like diplomacy is inherently about small cadre leaders negotiating with others, and then secondly, I just wanted to ask you about this the transformation you had back when you left the Foreign Service. is it was this something that you were in the service about over 10 years. Was this like that incident with the evidence in Iraq? Was it sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, or is it you were kind of swimming along, feeling really great about the work? I mean, I always feel like we always think of diplomats as just it's a real politic and like a quarter of whatever we come out here, we're always like, oh, diplomats are spies, or half of an embassy or spies or something like that. So was it something where over the years you were put up with it and this was the final straw, or you were more idealistic throughout the
well, independent diplomat helps governments and leaderships. It's a very much of the old world of diplomacy, but it helps only democratic governments which are marginalized in some way from the international system. So in a sense, it's trying to bring democratic voices into a very closed, opaque system that's dominated by a few powerful countries. And it operates in very much conventional diplomatic ways. It employs former diplomats like me, and we work within the current system. We're not trying to transform it, though we think by opening it up to marginalised actors, we are, in a sense, transforming it. And our clients are people like the government of South Sudan, government of Kosovo, government of Moldova, some of the small island states in the climate change process. But it's very much about government, so it's kind of ironic, given that I'm now quite anti-government. But I think it's consistent, of course, with a view that, actually if you include everybody in decisions, you get better decisions. And I think that's as true of the UN Security Council as it is of New York City budget planning. As for my own transformation, I mean, if you read this book or my earlier book about diplomacy, it's set out as a kind of logical process of transformation. My doubts grew, and then, there was this event. But actually, it was, like most things in life, much, much messier than that. I did really think I was going to be a diplomat for the rest of my career. I was very committed to it. It's a very good job. It's a lot of fun. And of course it brings very particular kind of social status and a pension, all of which I rather miss. And it was post facto that my disillusionment really grew. I mean, I was sitting in the boats, kind of thinking about what I'd been doing in New York, just up the road. I was one of the people who implemented sanctions on Iraq. That was me. I did that. I negotiated a lot of sanctions resolutions on Iraq in the face of considerable evidence of the humanitarian suffering of the Iraqi people. I did that. That was me. And when you contemplate things like that, which I had the chance to sit back and think about it, you do begin to see the contradictions in what you're doing. So, I mean, yes, there was a kind of process, but it was very jerky and rather erratic.
If I can indulge in a second question, it's a double-parted.
You're the last person to put up that hand.
So, two questions about your colleagues.
Yeah.
The first is, you've obviously had this realization that the world that you were living in was theater and was you just became disillusioned by it. Do you think that your colleagues feel it the same way, but they're along for the ride, or do they believe it and believe that they're actually succeeding in ways that you feel are false? And then the second, somewhat related question is, in the work that you're doing right now, do you find that the diplomats with whom you're engaged really respect what you're doing and really appreciate that you're giving a voice to countries or people who otherwise would not have a voice? Or do they see it as just a distraction?
The second question, I mean, much to my surprise, we've been really accepted in the diplomatic system, and most countries and diplomats will see us. And particularly as the years have gone on, when it was just me at the beginning, it was a bit difficult. I had to explain what I was trying to do each time I met somebody. And now independent diplomat in the world of diplomacy is reasonably well known. So it's got a kind of acceptance. And people, because we're former diplomats, we know how to talk to other diplomats respectfully, which is often the mistake that campaigners make. They think they're all monsters and realpolitik, and they wave their fingers at them and wave their hands at them, bang the table, and actually that doesn't work. If you talk to people normally, that's much more effective. The first question, I think there's an awful lot of very, very disillusioned people inside the international system. The observations that I've made about it are pretty commonplace. You only have to look out the window to see what's going on. And one of the odd things about a system that's very detached from reality is it's often a very dry, boring place to work. Because it's actually reality that's interesting, real people looking in the eye, drama. And when I first went to the UN Security Council many years ago, I remember being so excited I was going there. I couldn't believe this was actually going to be my job, negotiating the UN Security Council. I'm in the cockpit of the world's peace and security, dealing with wars, genocide, extraordinary things. And the weird thing was that it was often very boring to work there. It was like, this afternoon we've got Rwanda, then Palestine, and then we may squeeze in Sudan. And God, I can't wait for go out in the evening. It's weird, really weird that it should be that. And I really did put a lot of thought into why that was. And of course, if you were sitting on the outside, it's bloody obvious why that was. The real people weren't in there. There were no Rwandans, Palestinians, Sudanese actually in there arguing their case, saying this is what bloody well matters, And we've turned this reality into this arid discourse of countries' interests, which is completely abstract and false and separated. And actually, through that separation, we've lost something fundamental. And that, I guess, that interpretation of that reality is something I've expanded to the broader system. Whether successfully or not is for you to judge. Anyway, thank you all very much.
If you haven't gotten the is that book new in paperback, or is it just been out?
Oh yeah, where can we get?
No, it was published last week. This is a proof copy. I balled things up. I meant to bring a box of it today to sell books. But you can buy it. It's in St Mark's bookshop over there. You can buy it online as an e-book as well as a hardback. So please, buy lots of copies. Give it to your friends. Write nice things about it on Amazon.